The 23rd of December 1944. Bastogne. The fog was so thick you couldn't see a man at 30 yards. But one farm boy didn't need eyes. He listened to German boots crush frozen ground, smelled their cigarettes in the mist, then erased a patrol in 12 seconds with an M1 Garand. They mocked him as Farm Boy. 13 days later, he'd stacked 119 confirmed kills, and the men who laughed were whispering his name like a curse. Dawn, on December 23rd, came without light. The fog was so dense it swallowed sound, flattened depth, and erased distance. Men spoke in whispers not because they feared being heard, but because the world felt too close, like anything loud might tear it open. Visibility dropped below 30 yards. Rifles were held tight, fingers numb, eyes useless. Samuel Bridger lay prone in a shallow scrape he'd carved into frozen earth hours earlier. He hadn't slept. He hadn't moved. His M1 Garand was wrapped in strips of burlap torn from a sandbag to kill any trace of shine. The iron sights were meaningless in this weather. Bridger ignored them. He listened. At first, it was nothing, just wind dragging across branches. Then a rhythm that didn't belong, not random, measured, the soft, deliberate crunch of frozen ground being compressed by weight, trying not to make noise. A pause, then another step. Metal brushed metal, someone easing a bolt forward too carefully. German patrol. Bridger counted without thinking. Spacing, cadence, 8, maybe 10 men, moving parallel to the American line, probing for a weak point. He adjusted his body by inches, movements so slow they didn't disturb the frost beneath him. His breathing slowed until it matched the forest. At 0543, shapes emerged from the fog. Not clear figures, just darker smudges moving where nothing should be moving. The lead soldier stepped forward, cautious, unaware that he had already been hunted. Bridger fired. The first shot hit center mass. The body dropped before the sound finished echoing. Bridger was already shifting, already tracking the second shape by motion and spacing rather than sight. Another shot, then another. The Garand's semi-automatic rhythm cut through the fog, controlled, efficient, relentless. 12 seconds. 7 shots. 6 men fell before the rest understood what was happening. The survivors didn't charge. They didn't return fire. They broke and ran, panicked by bullets coming from a place that didn't exist. One more dropped as they fled, the 8th round, snapping out of the rifle before the clip ejected with its metallic ping. Silence returned to the fog. Bridger didn't move. He didn't celebrate. He didn't even check the bodies. He reloaded, shifted his weight, and waited, because hunters know the first shot is never the end. Behind him, American soldiers stared into the mist, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. 7 kills in 12 seconds. No machine gun, no optics, no visibility. Word spread quietly down the line. The joke stopped completely that morning. The nickname Farm Boy was never spoken again, not as mockery, not even as humor. From that moment on, when the fog rolled in and men felt blind, they began to look toward the silent figure in the snow. Because somewhere in the white nothingness of Bastogne, there was now a man who could see without eyes. After December 23rd, Samuel Bridger was no longer treated like a replacement. He was treated like a resource. The German attacks didn't stop. They intensified. Fog and snow continued to strangle visibility, turning every tree line into a potential breach point. Units all around Bastogne were being probed, tested, searched for weakness. And in Company C's sector, a pattern began to form. If Bridger said the Germans were coming, they came. If he said they were close, they were already too close. By December 24th, the company commander made a quiet decision. Bridger wasn't just going to warn anymore, he was going to hunt. Permission was given for solo reconnaissance beyond the wire. No radio chatter, no escort, just a single rifleman slipping into no man's land between American foxholes and German lines. In weather that erased men whole, it was the kind of mission doctrine warned against. But doctrine had never been written for someone like Bridger. He moved the way he always had, slow, deliberate, invisible. He stepped only when wind stirred branches or distant artillery masked sound. He froze for minutes at a time when the forest went still. His breathing was shallow, controlled, more like an animal than a soldier. Snow and frost betrayed nothing beneath his feet. Where trained infantry crept, Bridger flowed, from shallow folds in the ground, from behind fallen timber, from shadows inside abandoned farm structures. He observed German activity forming in the mist, assembly areas, mortar positions, command posts marked by too many voices in one place. He memorized patterns, then slid back to American lines and whispered what he'd found. Artillery followed, and when targets presented themselves, German runners crossing open gaps, officers stepping out to orient themselves, soldiers smoking where they believed they were unseen, Bridger fired. One shot, one body. No follow-up. No signature. German units began reporting something they couldn't explain. Men were dying without warning. Not in firefights, not in attacks, just gone. Patrols returned short-handed. Recon teams hesitated before moving. Officers complained that soldiers were refusing point duty in fog. A captured diary from a German infantryman would later describe it plainly. An American hunter operates alone in our sector. He appears and disappears. We never see him. We only find the dead. By Christmas Eve night, Bridger's confirmed kill count had climbed sharply. But numbers no longer told the real story. German patrols slowed. Attacks lost coordination. Entire stretches of terrain were avoided, not because they were heavily defended, but because something invisible lived there. The farm boy had become a ghost. And the fog, once a curse, had turned into his greatest weapon. Christmas Day, December 25th, 1944, arrived with no peace. The fog thinned just enough to reveal shapes again, and that made the fighting worse. German commanders, knowing American relief forces were close, ordered maximum pressure. They needed Bastogne cracked open before the siege could be broken. Infantry moved forward, supported by armor, pushing hard against exhausted American lines. In Bridger's sector, the attack came through a shallow approach overlooked by a ruined farmhouse. Bridger was already there. Positioned on the upper floor, firing through a shattered wall, he watched German infantry attempt to follow their tanks forward. The moment they exposed themselves, he fired. Not fast, not wild, methodical. Each shot was a decision. Each decision ended a life. For 90 straight minutes, the rifle never cooled. Rounds were fed in clip after clip. Bridger fired over 160 shots, pausing only to reload or shift position as debris fell around him. Men who tried to rush forward collapsed. Men who hesitated collapsed. German infantry began dropping to the ground, unsure where death was coming from, while American soldiers below watched in disbelief. It wasn't rage driving him. It was routine. By the time the attack broke, 41 German soldiers lay dead in front of that farmhouse, the highest single-day total of the siege. Somewhere during the exchange, a fragment from German artillery tore into Bridger's left shoulder. Blood soaked his jacket. He ignored it. Others were worse off. He stayed. On December 26th, Patton's Third Army punched through the encirclement. Bastogne was no longer isolated, but the fighting didn't stop immediately. German units tried to withdraw under pressure, and Bridger went back to work one last time, interdicting retreat routes with the same cold precision. When the counting finally ended, the numbers were reviewed, verified, cut down by procedure. Official tally: 119 confirmed kills in 13 days. 15 more were listed as probable. They were never added. The paperwork described Bridger clinically exceptional marksmanship, unique reconnaissance ability, psychological impact on enemy forces. But what it couldn't capture was the silence that followed him afterward. The way men stopped joking when he passed. The way soldiers who once mocked him now waited for his nod before relaxing. Bridger didn't change. The situation did. The fog lifted, the siege ended, and the war moved on. But the lesson of Bastogne remained burned into the men who survived it. The skills they had laughed at, those backward farm boy instincts, had kept them alive. Samuel Bridger never celebrated the number. He never spoke of victory. 13 days in the Ardennes had proven something far heavier than heroism. That when the world goes blind, the man who learned to survive without sight becomes the most dangerous thing in it. When the siege of Bastogne ended, Samuel Bridger didn't walk out as a legend. He walked out as a man carrying weight. 119 German soldiers were dead because the fog that blinded everyone else had revealed what he truly was, a hunter shaped by poverty, silence, and necessity. The skills that once earned him ridicule had saved lives, broken attacks, and bent enemy plans. But they had also taken a permanent toll. Bridger never boasted. He never framed his story as triumph. Years later, he would say the number didn't represent pride, only responsibility. Each kill was a human life ended, not a score earned. War had demanded his skills, not his approval. The men who mocked him learned something Bastogne winter made impossible to ignore. Ability doesn't always look impressive at first glance. Sometimes it looks quiet, rural, outdated, until the moment conditions strip away comfort and expose truth. The farm boy never changed. Only the fog did. And when sight failed, the man they laughed at became the reason they survived. Here is another truth hidden inside Samuel Bridger's story, one that is harder to confront. Extraordinary effectiveness in war often comes from ordinary lives shaped by hardship. Bridger was not trained to be lethal by ideology or ambition. He was shaped by necessity. Poverty did not give him choices, it gave him consequences. Missed shots meant hunger. Carelessness meant failure. Over time, those consequences carved habits so deep that they became instinct. War did not create those instincts. It merely exposed their value. This matters because modern societies often mistake comfort for progress. When environments become safer, cleaner, and more forgiving, certain skills atrophy. Awareness dulls. Patience shortens. The ability to operate under uncertainty weakens. Bridger's effectiveness was not proof that rural life was superior, it was proof that hardship creates capabilities comfort does not require. That leads to another uncomfortable lesson. Necessity is often the greatest teacher. Bridger did not learn discipline from doctrine. He learned it from hunger. He did not learn patience from lectures. He learned it from long mornings in fog where moving too early meant failure. These lessons were not moral, they were practical. War simply gave them a new application. This explains why his actions disturbed him later in life. He understood that his effectiveness was built on survival skills learned in childhood, not hatred or ideology. He did not kill because he wanted to. He killed because he knew how, and because the situation demanded it. That distinction haunted him. It forced him to recognize that capability and morality are not the same thing. This is another critical lesson. Being capable does not mean being righteous. Bridger never confused the two. He did not build his identity around what he did in those 13 days. He refused to let war define his worth. Instead, he carried its weight quietly, returning to a life that mirrored his origins, working with land, animals, and preservation rather than destruction. That choice reveals something rare. Many who experience extreme competence in violence struggle afterward because nothing in civilian life seems meaningful by comparison. Bridger avoided that trap by grounding himself in purpose rather than validation. He chose work that aligned with restraint, stewardship, and responsibility. Another lesson emerges here. True strength often seeks silence, not applause. Bridger did not tell his story until others came looking for it decades later. His medals stayed in drawers. His rifle became an artifact, not a symbol. This was not false humility. It was understanding. He knew that remembering too loudly risked forgetting the cost. This stands in contrast to how modern culture often treats war stories, simplifying them into inspiration or spectacle. Bridger's silence resists that simplification. It reminds us that some experiences lose meaning when turned into entertainment. There's also a lesson about leadership. Bridger was not promoted rapidly. He was not placed in command, yet his influence reshaped how an entire sector fought. This reveals a truth many organizations ignore. Impact does not always come from authority. Leadership is not always visible. Sometimes it lies in reliability, sometimes in awareness, sometimes in being the one person who sees what others cannot and speaks only when necessary. Bridger led not by commanding, but by preventing disaster before it occurred. This kind of leadership rarely receives recognition, yet it often saves the most lives. Finally, Bridger's story forces us to confront the moral ambiguity of war itself. He was effective. He was necessary. He was also deeply aware that each life he took had weight. He rejected the idea that history's approval could erase that burden. That refusal is perhaps the most important lesson of all. War demands action. History records outcomes, but conscience lives with consequences. Bridger carried all three. In the end, the fog of Bastogne did not just conceal soldiers, it stripped away illusions. It showed that arrogance collapses under pressure, that adaptability outweighs doctrine, and that judgment based on background is a luxury reality eventually removes. The farm boy did not become extraordinary in the fog. The fog simply revealed what had always been there, and that is the lesson worth remembering. There is one final layer to Samuel Bridger's story that is often overlooked: the way war exposes not only individual capability, but collective bias. Before Bastogne, the platoon's social hierarchy was already fixed. City soldiers spoke louder, joked more, and occupied the cultural center of the group. Rural recruits existed on the margins. They were tolerated, not trusted. This hierarchy had nothing to do with competence. It was built on familiarity and shared identity. War dismantled it in days. When fog erased visibility, confidence rooted in urban experience collapsed. Soldiers who had always felt capable suddenly felt helpless. At the same time, the quiet man they had dismissed became indispensable. This reversal was not gradual, it was immediate, and it was uncomfortable. That discomfort matters. It revealed how quickly people attach value to background rather than ability. Bridger's skills were not newly discovered, they were newly needed. The environment changed, and with it, the rules of relevance. This exposes a broader truth. Many forms of prejudice persist only because circumstances have not yet tested them. When conditions change, assumptions fail. Another lesson lies in how Bridger was used once his value became clear. He was not celebrated publicly. He was not paraded as a symbol. Instead, he was quietly repositioned where he could do the most good. His commanders recognized something critical. Exceptional individuals are not always meant to inspire, they are meant to stabilize. This reflects a mature understanding of leadership. Rather than exploiting Bridger for morale or myth, they protected his role. They kept him where his skills mattered most. This restraint prevented his effectiveness from becoming recklessness. It also prevented unnecessary exposure. In war, knowing when not to use someone is as important as knowing when to deploy them. This introduces another lesson. Wisdom lies in application, not recognition. Many organizations fail not because they lack talent, but because they misuse it. Bridger's story is a rare example of correct alignment between ability and responsibility under extreme pressure. There is also a deeper psychological cost embedded in his silence after the war. Bridger did not speak because language could not reduce what he carried. 13 days of continuous combat rewires perception. Time compresses, memory fragments. The mind adapts to survive, then struggles to readapt when survival is no longer the goal. His reluctance to discuss Bastogne was not avoidance. It was respect for the dead, for the truth, and for the limits of explanation. This silence challenges modern expectations that trauma must always be verbalized to be processed. Sometimes endurance expresses itself through restraint. Another overlooked lesson concerns how societies remember war. Bridger's story survived not because he promoted it, but because records preserved it. After-action reports, enemy diaries, witness statements. These documents do not exaggerate emotion, they describe effect. This matters because memory anchored in documentation resists myth-making. When stories are told only through emotion, they drift toward simplification. When they are anchored in evidence, they retain complexity. Bridger's legacy survived because it could not be easily romanticized without confronting its cost. This is a warning for modern audiences. Admiring effectiveness without acknowledging consequence distorts history. Bridger's reflections prevent that distortion. He refused to let success erase tragedy. He refused to let recognition absolve responsibility. Another layer emerges when considering post-war adaptation. Many veterans struggle because wartime competence does not translate cleanly into civilian life. Bridger avoided this trap not because he escaped trauma, but because he chose purpose over validation. Wildlife management offered structure, responsibility, and restraint, the opposite of chaos. This suggests another lesson. Healing often comes from continuity, not reinvention. Bridger did not reject who he was. He returned to it. He applied the same patience, observation, and respect for life that had once been used for survival, now redirected toward preservation. Finally, Bridger's story forces confrontation with a truth that extends far beyond war. People are rarely seen for their full capacity until pressure removes illusion. Comfort hides difference. Crisis reveals it. Those dismissed as insignificant often carry skills that only extreme conditions expose. This does not mean hardship should be glorified. It means that judgment, based on surface identity, is always incomplete. In Bastogne, fog erased vision but sharpened truth. It showed who could adapt. It showed who could listen. It showed who could act without ego. Samuel Bridger did not seek to be seen. When the fog lifted, what remained was not a hero defined by numbers, but a man defined by restraint, awareness, and the quiet understanding that effectiveness carries responsibility long after victory fades. That understanding, not the kill count, is the final lesson of the farm boy in the fog. With distance, Samuel Bridger's story becomes less about war and more about humanity under pressure. Bastogne was not unique because of weather or tactics. It was unique because it removed illusion. In those 13 days, status meant nothing, education meant nothing, background meant nothing until it did. What remained was capability measured only by outcome. This is a difficult truth to accept. Modern societies prefer comfort over confrontation. We reward confidence, visibility, and articulation. We mistake loudness for competence and fluency for depth. Bridger possessed none of those traits. He was not persuasive. He was not charismatic. He did not explain himself well. He simply understood the environment. That understanding is increasingly rare. As systems grow more complex, individuals become more specialized. People learn to operate within narrow lanes defined by procedure. When those procedures fail, many freeze. Bridger did not freeze because his skills were not dependent on systems. They were dependent on awareness. This leads to another lesson. Resilience comes from fundamentals, not sophistication. The most robust skills are those that function when tools are stripped away. Sound, scent, patience, discipline. These are ancient abilities, refined long before technology promised control over uncertainty. Bastogne punished reliance on tools and rewarded mastery of fundamentals. That lesson extends far beyond war. Organizations collapse not when resources disappear, but when adaptability does. Individuals fail not when plans change, but when identity is tied too tightly to a single way of operating. Bridger survived because his identity was not tied to doctrine. It was tied to function. There is also a lesson about recognition. Bridger's story survived because it was inconvenient. It did not fit heroic narratives. It did not celebrate victory without cost. It refused simplicity. Stories like his are often forgotten because they resist inspiration. They force reflection instead. This is why such stories matter. They remind us that history is not a sequence of triumphs, but a record of adaptation under constraint. They challenge the idea that greatness looks impressive in the moment. Often, it looks like silence, patience, and endurance. Another truth emerges when considering how Bridger measured himself. He never measured his worth by comparison. He did not ask whether he was better than others. He asked whether he was effective when needed. This internal metric insulated him from both mockery and praise. That is rare. Most people define themselves by external validation. Bridger defined himself by responsibility. When the responsibility ended, he did not cling to the identity it created. He let it go. This ability to release identity may be the hardest lesson of all. Many veterans struggle because war gives them a clear role that peace does not replace. Bridger avoided that trap because he never let the role consume him. He understood that what he did was temporary, even if the consequences were permanent. That distinction preserved him. There is also a lesson here about justice. Bridger's effectiveness was rewarded with decoration, but the reward never equaled the cost. No medal could. This exposes a fundamental limitation of institutional recognition. It can acknowledge action, but it cannot absorb consequence. Understanding this prevents resentment. Bridger did not expect fairness from history. He accepted imbalance. He accepted that some acts matter more than they are remembered, and others are remembered more than they matter. This acceptance is not resignation, it is clarity. Finally, the fog of Bastogne leaves us with a question rather than an answer. How many people are misunderstood because their skills do not fit current conditions? How many are dismissed because their strengths are quiet, situational, or unfashionable? How many will only be recognized when failure makes recognition unavoidable? Bridger's story suggests an uncomfortable response. Most. The fog does not create capability. It reveals it. And when it does, it is usually too late to pretend we did not need it. Samuel Bridger did not ask to be understood. He did not ask to be admired. He asked only to do what was necessary. That is why his story endures. Not as a legend of violence, but as a lesson in humility about how easily people are misjudged, how fragile certainty truly is, and how quiet competence often carries the heaviest burden of all. To survive the aftermath of war, many soldiers struggle not because they fought, but because they cannot leave behind the identity forged in combat. Heha never fully entered that identity. He did what was necessary, then let it end. This is a powerful lesson about boundaries. Knowing when to act is important. Knowing when to stop is equally vital. The story also challenges the idea that innovation always comes from complexity. Heha's most effective techniques, packing snow, freezing, firing positions, holding snow in his mouth, were brutally simple. They emerged not from laboratories, but from observation. He noticed patterns and solved problems with available materials. Innovation, in this sense, is not invention, it is adaptation. Complex systems often fail because they require ideal conditions to function. Simple systems endure because they tolerate error. Heha's methods did not rely on precision manufacturing or fragile components. They relied on physics, biology, and environment, things that do not change under stress. This principle applies far beyond warfare. The most resilient solutions are often the least elegant on paper. Another lesson emerges from the Red Army's failure to adapt quickly. Despite mounting evidence, doctrine lagged behind reality. Leadership clung to established beliefs, even as losses mounted. This is not unique to the Soviet Union. Organizations rarely abandon doctrine willingly. They wait until failure forces change. By then, damage is already done. Heha succeeded not because the Red Army was incompetent, but because it was rigid. Rigidity is deadly in dynamic environments. Flexibility is not optional, it is survival. Those who adapt early suffer less than those who adapt late. This is true in war, markets, and personal life. The cost of adaptation increases over time. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from Heha's story is this. Mastery of environment outweighs mastery of tools. He did not dominate because he was stronger or faster. He dominated because he belonged. The forest was not hostile to him. It was familiar. Belonging creates advantage. Outsiders must learn rules under pressure. Insiders act instinctively. This raises a deeper point about preparation. True preparation is not reactive. It is immersive. Heha did not study Finland during the war. He lived it long before. When crisis arrived, he did not scramble to learn. He executed what he already knew. This is why preparation must occur before it seems necessary. Skills built during calm moments determine outcomes during chaos. Finally, Heha's life after war reminds us that survival is not the same as victory. He lived, but he carried scars. He found peace not through recognition, but through withdrawal. He returned to animals, forests, and routines, things that asked nothing from him. In doing so, he demonstrated another form of strength, the ability to step away from violence without needing validation. The Red Army dismissed his rifle as useless because it did not fit their image of modern war. History proved that image incomplete. War, like life, does not reward assumptions. It rewards understanding. It rewards patience. And it rewards those who listen more than they speak. In the frozen forests of Finland, a quiet farmer proved that the most dangerous weapon is not firepower, but familiarity. Not aggression, but restraint. Not technology, but adaptation. And that lesson, unlike the war itself, has never gone out of date. War is usually explained with diagrams, arrows on maps, tables of production, ratios of men, tanks, aircraft, and artillery. These abstractions make conflict appear manageable, even logical. They create the comforting illusion that war is something that can be solved by scale and planning. But the story of Simo Heha dismantles that illusion completely. In the frozen forests of Finland, war stopped behaving like a system and became something older, more primitive, and far less forgiving. The Red Army entered Finland in 1939 with absolute confidence. It had numbers beyond comparison, machines built by an industrial state, and a doctrine designed for modern warfare. From Moscow, the invasion looked like a formality. Finland was smaller, poorer, and militarily inferior by every measurable standard. The outcome appeared predetermined. What Soviet planners failed to understand was that numbers only matter if they can be applied. In Finland, the environment refused to cooperate. Snow erased roads. Forests swallowed formations. Cold punished every mistake. Visibility collapsed. Communication broke down. In those conditions, doctrine became a liability rather than an advantage. The Red Army had trained for movement, momentum, and concentration of force. Finland offered stillness, isolation, and fragmentation. What looked like overwhelming power on paper dissolved into confusion on the ground. Simo Heha did not defeat the Red Army by challenging its strength. He defeated it by exposing its assumptions. He never tried to match firepower with firepower or speed with speed. He understood that doing so would guarantee his own destruction. Instead, he fought a different war, one shaped by patience, concealment, and familiarity with the land. He turned the battlefield into something the Red Army could not control or even fully perceive. One of the first lessons from Heha's story is that mastery is rarely sudden. His effectiveness did not emerge when the war began. It was the product of decades of quiet preparation. Hunting birds in Finnish forests taught him skills no military academy could replicate. Distance estimation without instruments, breath control under pressure, absolute stillness for hours at a time, an intuitive understanding of how living beings move when they feel threatened. None of this was glamorous. None of it was designed for war. Yet when war arrived, these skills proved decisive. Modern systems often emphasize rapid training, specialization, and efficiency. Heha's life suggests a different truth. Deep, generalized mastery built over time adapts better than narrow expertise built quickly. His skills were transferable because they were fundamental. They were not tied to a specific weapon or tactic. They were tied to perception, discipline, and environment. When conditions changed, his competence remained. Another lesson lies in his rejection of technology that did not serve the context. Hehe was not anti-modern. He simply understood that tools are only as useful as their compatibility with conditions. Scopes reflected light in snow. They fogged in extreme cold. They required a higher shooting profile. In theory, they offered precision. In practice, they increased risk. Iron sights, though primitive by contemporary standards, worked reliably in the cold and allowed him to remain invisible. This challenges a common belief that newer technology always equals progress. History repeatedly shows that technological advantage is conditional. It depends on environment, logistics, maintenance, and user behavior. When any of these factors break down, sophistication becomes fragility. Hehe's success was not about rejecting progress. It was about selecting reliability over novelty. Reliability, in extreme conditions, is more valuable than capability. A weapon that works every time is deadlier than one that works perfectly only under ideal circumstances. This principle extends far beyond warfare. In business, engineering, medicine, and personal life, systems that tolerate error survive longer than systems optimized for perfection. Hehe's methods were crude but robust. They functioned in cold, silence, and isolation. They did not require resupply, calibration, or coordination. Visibility plays another critical role in this story. Modern conflict often emphasizes dominance through presence, control of territory, visible force, constant activity. Hehe inverted this logic. His power came from absence. He was effective precisely because he could not be seen, tracked, or predicted. This created a psychological effect far greater than his physical impact. Fear does not require large numbers to spread. It requires uncertainty. Soviet soldiers were not terrified because they were losing battles. They were terrified because they could not locate the threat. They could not retaliate. They could not restore control. The forest became a place of constant anticipation, where every pause felt dangerous. This kind of fear erodes morale, silently and irreversibly. The lesson here is that influence often operates invisibly. The most disruptive forces are not always the loudest or most obvious. They are the ones that destabilize expectations. Hehe did not overwhelm the Red Army. He confused it. He forced it to react rather than act. Once reaction replaces intention, control is lost. Patience is often misunderstood as passivity. Hehe's patience was active. It was disciplined restraint. He did not fire when targets appeared. He fired when targets mattered. He waited not because he hesitated, but because he understood timing. This level of self-control is rare, especially under stress. Most people act to relieve discomfort, not to maximize outcome. Hehe tolerated discomfort as part of the process. Stillness, in his case, was a weapon. Remaining motionless for hours in sub-zero temperatures required not just physical endurance, but mental dominance over impulse. Every instinct tells a human being to move, to adjust, to seek relief. Hehe, over hunger. Rumors circulated among the ranks. Some claimed the Finns were using dozens of hidden shooters. Others insisted the sniper was not human at all, but something that belonged to the forest itself. The nickname spread quickly, the White Death. It was spoken quietly, almost superstitiously, as if saying it too loudly might draw attention. Attempts to triangulate the shooter's position failed repeatedly. Artillery was brought in to blanket suspected areas, shelling stretches of forest into broken timber and churned snow. When the bombardments ended, Soviet units advanced cautiously, believing no one could survive such fire. Minutes later, shots rang out again. Another man fell. The silence returned. What made the situation unbearable was not just the casualties, but the uncertainty. There was no clear enemy line, no visible threat to engage. Soldiers could not fight back against what they could not see. Each step forward felt like an invitation to death. Morale collapsed in slow, quiet ways, shaking hands, whispered prayers, eyes darting at every sound. Simo continued his routine without deviation. He did not chase kills or fire recklessly. He waited. He observed. He chose targets that mattered, removing leaders, gunners, and scouts whose absence multiplied confusion. Each shot deepened the sense that the forest was watching, judging, and punishing every mistake. By the time Soviet commanders acknowledged the scale of the problem, it was no longer about eliminating a single sniper. The damage had already been done. Entire units were stalled, pinned psychologically by a man they had never seen, armed with a rifle they had once dismissed as obsolete. The Red Army had come to Finland expecting a short campaign, decided by numbers and machines. Instead, in the frozen silence of the forest, they were learning that fear could spread faster than any army, and that one patient hunter could break the will of thousands. By early February, Soviet high command could no longer ignore what was happening in the forests along the Karelian front. Reports from the field had shifted in tone. What began as complaints about sniper harassment had turned into descriptions of paralysis. Units were advancing only a few hundred meters a day. Some refused to move at all. The problem was no longer tactical, it was psychological. Orders were issued to end it by any means necessary. If the sniper could not be found, the land itself would be destroyed. Artillery units were repositioned, and grid coordinates were marked across entire sections of forest. The plan was simple and brutal: saturate the area with shells until nothing living could remain. Trees would be shattered, snow churned into mud and ice, and any hidden positions erased through sheer force. Before these bombardments, Soviet units made one last attempt to flush the sniper out. Large patrols advanced deliberately, firing into likely hiding spots, cutting branches, and detonating grenades to provoke a response. The forest answered only with silence. Men grew jumpy, fingers tightened on triggers. Every sound felt amplified, every pause unbearable. Then the shots returned. Men fell in quick succession, struck with the same precision as before. The firing never lingered. It appeared from one direction, vanished, then reappeared from another. The illusion of a lone sniper was replaced by the belief that they were surrounded. Panic spread unevenly but persistently, eroding discipline. Soldiers fired wildly into the trees, wasting ammunition and revealing positions that only made them easier targets. Simoheha remained methodical. He did not increase his pace. He did not grow careless. Each engagement ended with relocation, each position carefully abandoned before the enemy could respond. He understood that survival depended not on aggression, but on restraint. The forest offered endless places to hide, but only if one respected its rhythms. On March 6, 1940, the 99th day of his campaign, the war finally reached him. Amid the confusion of an advancing Soviet unit, a soldier fired blindly in panic, using explosive ammunition. The bullet struck Simo in the face and detonated on impact. The force shattered his jaw and tore away flesh and bone. He collapsed instantly into the snow. When Finnish soldiers reached the area, they found devastation. Simo was barely recognizable. His injuries appeared fatal. In the chaos of battle and the bitter cold, his body was placed among the dead. Word spread quickly. The White Death was gone. Relief swept through Soviet ranks. The ghost had finally been killed. But the cold that had tormented so many men now worked in Simo's favor. His body temperature dropped rapidly, slowing his metabolism and preserving what little life remained. He did not bleed out. He did not die. He lay unconscious, frozen, indistinguishable from the fallen around him as the fighting continued and then gradually faded. Days passed. The forest grew quiet again, not from fear this time, but from exhaustion. On March 13th, 1940, the Winter War ended. A ceasefire was declared. Guns fell silent. On that same day, as the battlefield settled into uneasy calm, Simoheha opened his eyes. He had survived. The man the Red Army believed it had erased was still alive, pulled back from death by the very cold and silence he had mastered. The war that had turned him into a legend was over, but its lessons had already been written in blood across the snow. Simoheha did not return from the war as a hero in the way legends are usually told. He returned broken, scarred, and silent. Surgeons worked on his shattered face again and again, rebuilding bone where explosive metal had destroyed it. Each operation was slow and painful. Recovery took years. The war had ended, but its cost remained written permanently into his body. When he was finally